Today on the show, we're going to sit down with Don Brown. He's a candidate for North Carolina's U.S. Senate seat in 2026. Don is originally from Eastern North Carolina. He has earned a Bachelor of Arts degree at UNC Chapel Hill and a Juris Doctor degree of Campbell University. Don has authored 16 books, including 4 national bestsellers. Don served in the U.S. Navy as a JAG officer and earned a non-resident certificate in international law from the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and has been published in the Navy Law Review. He's now aiming for the U.S. Senate, campaigning as a constitutional conservative with bold policy ideas like creating U.S. Border Command and slashing federal bureaucracy. He's already drawing contrasts with his competitors, including fellow Republican Andy Nilsen and RNC Chairman Michael Whatley. Today, we're going to cut through the headlines and talk substance, not sound bites. This interview is not going to be a puff piece. It's going to be a real conversation with a man running to represent you, the North Carolina voter. So with that, let's get started.
This is The Springer Show, the voice of conservative truth. And now, here is your host, Brian Springer.
Hello, everybody. Welcome in. We're so glad to have you today. I appreciate every one of you being with me and taking this ride. As mentioned before, today we're going to bring in Don Brown. He's running for Tom Tillis's soon-to-be vacated Senate seat. So, without further ado, here's Don. Don, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Ron, thanks for having me. I love the intro music and appreciate the thorough introduction there. Looking forward to having a nice chat with you this evening.
I sure hope so. So, Don, you've got a lot of accomplishments in your life. You've done a whole lot. But let's kind of start towards the beginning, if you don't mind. You grew up in Plymouth, North Carolina. What was life like for you growing up, and what sort of values were instilled in you that still kind of shape who you are today?
Well, Brian, I would not swap my experience growing up for anything. Plymouth is the county seat of Washington County, which is, I believe, the third least populated county in the state and the poorest economically. That might not have quite always been the case, but there was a large, we called it the pulp mill or a warehouse plant that basically was the center of the economy down there. Our schools were. We had some fabulous teachers, and especially early on, but never really had the money, to compete with other school districts. But, you learn so much because I had 2 granddaddies I was very close with. My granddaddy Brown was a tobacco farmer and a rural mail carrier, so I grew up, working in tobacco part of the time. My granddaddy Harrison, he would take me fishing. My granddaddy Brown lived in Jamesville. See, Plymouth is on the Martin County, Washington County border. And Washington County is just east of Martin County. Martin County, the county seat is Williamston. And my granddaddy Brown lived in Jamesville, and he owned a tobacco farm and also was a rural mail carrier in the Depression. And he carried the mail to Jim and Gaylord Perry, the Perry brothers, the famous pitchers. And so I was very influenced by both my grandfathers. And so from one, I learned to love baseball, although I was never good at it. And I got to work on the farm, work around hogs, work in tobacco. My granddaddy Harrison, who lived in Plymouth and worked at the warehouse plant, pulp mill plant, would take me on his boat fishing. So I was all over the waters in the Roanoke River and the Albemarle Sound, later the Pamlico Sound, developed a love for boats and eventually ships. And I remember my granddaddy Harrison, when I was just a little kid, took me to see USS North Carolina, which I was down there again yesterday, campaigning in Wilmington, and developed a love for the Navy. And so to answer your question, we didn't have a lot, but we did have a lot. You know what I mean? And so from my childhood, I learned how to talk to anybody, even though I didn't learn calculus or Latin or anything like that they would learn in some of the fancy schools up in Charlotte and that sort of thing, I learned a lot that a lot of those kids did not learn, and I would not trade it for anything. And also, I love my sister is still there. My mom and dad, they all went to see Jesus. One of my sisters went to see Jesus, but my younger sister is a retired postmaster, Amy Swing, in Bath, North Carolina, which is the oldest town in North Carolina, about 30 miles from Plymouth over in Beaufort County. She still lives in Plymouth. So I get there whenever I can. I like to get there just to get away from the rat race. And if you've ever been there, Plymouth is on the Roanoke River, and it's just gorgeous. And I just like to go down there and maybe strike a stogie and just spend time. And so you ask a loaded question, I guess, but I'm really a small town boy at heart and an Eastern North Carolina boy at heart. And I hope that wasn't too long of an answer to a short question.
No, absolutely not. That's fine. We kind of want to know, as the North Carolina voters, who we're going to vote for. We want to know your background. We want to know who you are as a person, not just your policies. To me, at least, that's important. So I see that, you've got a good rural background. You've been out on the water. You've been in the beautiful countryside that North Carolina has to offer. So you had that slow raising, that common sense raising. There's nothing wrong with strong education, which you also have. You kind of answered one of my questions too. You were mentioning how you were raised on the water, around boats, and your love of boats and ships. Sort of kind of pushed you to naval service. And the next thing I was going to ask you is, growing up, what drew you to the military service? Was it just being on the water with your family and being around boats and stuff like that?
Well, yes, I think so. I remember the first days my granddaddy took me down to see the battleship, and I got an interest there. And the USS North Carolina is a treasure to this state. I'm so glad we have it. As a former naval officer, I'm really just proud and grateful that it's there. And so I developed a love for being around the water. Norfolk Naval Base, or as they call it, Norfolk, up in the tabularies.
Norfolk.
Yeah, that's right. Is fairly close to Plymouth. And back in the day, before Highway 64 was 4-lane to Raleigh, I mean, Norfolk was kind of the main big town that folks went to in that section of the state. You have Plymouth, you have Edenton, which is across the Sound, Elizabeth City, which is in Pasco County, Windsor, Hertford, and Norfolk's a little closer than Raleigh. So we were up there a lot in Virginia Beach, and so being around the Navy ships. But I really, as much as I loved it, I never really I went off and on about going into the military, and it really wasn't until almost my senior year at college that I said, "Hey, man, I want to do this." Sometimes I wish I got started sooner, but wound up taking the OCS test and the AOCS test, Navy, I should say OCS and AOCS, when I was at Chapel Hill, when I was in school there. And at the time, they were taking a lot of engineers in the Navy, and I had a liberal arts degree, and they were full. But one thing led to another, and my vision was not corrected. I want to be a Navy pilot, but my vision was not corrected, and so I went up in the JAG program and never turned back. But it really goes back to those roots, to tell you the truth. And I've always been a patriotic and a patriot, and I would not, like I say, I shared a moment ago, I wouldn't trade my upbringing for anything. I would swap it for the richest upbringing in South Charlotte. I would not do that, and I'm not knocking those folks. I'm just saying that I think I learned more in terms of human nature, human relations, than I would. And the same thing is true for my naval service. I wouldn't trade that for anything, And not everybody has the opportunity to do that, and I was very, very fortunate, very blessed. And the U.S. Navy means a lot to me. My service as a naval officer means more to me than that. I mean, and I'm not knocking anything that I do. As you mentioned, I've been blessed to write some books. I am a practicing attorney, but my service as a naval officer means more than all that. And so you're touching on some questions here. They're going straight to the heart. I hope I'm answering them okay, but I would do it all over again if I had to do it again, Brian. I really would.
You're doing a great job, Don. Just keep doing what you're doing. There's something to be said about, and I probably mentioned this before, but there's something to be said about a rural upbringing. It really is a whole lot different than fast-paced city life.
Exactly.
You mentioned your time in the Navy, and you served in the U.S. Navy's JAG Corps. For those that don't understand or don't know, that's the Judge Advocate General Corps, basically right. The lawyer corps for the Navy.
Right.
You retired as a lieutenant commander after serving 16 years.
Right. Well, I did. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask what that experience was like for you, but go ahead with.
Well, to be clear, I did not retire. I left the reserves, I would have had to stay another 4 years to retire. And one of those, but I was at 04 at the time, and one of the regrets is my law practice got so busy at the time that but I did serve 16 years, and I can tell you 5 of those were active, and spent time in San Diego and Charleston, South Carolina, at Newport, Rhode Island, and at the Pentagon, and had orders to Saudi Arabia for Persian Gulf First Persian Gulf War. And the interesting thing about it is that storming Norman Schwarzkopf stormed right across the south side of Iraq there so fast and took them out so fast that they sent me to the Pentagon instead of Saudi Arabia. I often wonder what if, So, but that was an interesting experience as well. But it's I've later. You mentioned that I've been blessed to be able to write. I'm kind of a military author, and the first number of books that I wrote was on them were Navy JAG books. Nobody knew what JAG was really until that. Well, first of all, there was that movie, A Few Good Men, that you may have seen with Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise and Demi Moore, and that movie was actually based on a real story.
Wait, are there people in this world who haven't seen that movie?
Who knows these days? It's kind of hard to know. Some of these younger whippersnappers may not have. I think it's Jack Nicholson's finest performance, but that was based on a true story. And in fact, I knew the JAG attorney, JAG lieutenant, who was Don McCary, who Tom Cruise played his role in the movie. And but it was the show JAG, which is not as realistic as the movie. Even though the movie's a little embellished too at places, but the show JAG, back I guess in the early 2000s, that everybody knew what a JAG officer was when they had that show. It was the hottest show on TV at one time. But I was, of course, on active duty before that show came out. But I was on active duty when the Navy we actually cooperated with Paramount in the making of A Few Good Men. And my claim to fame, Brian, is one day I was at the Pentagon. And back in those days, I was in pretty good shape, I have to say, relatively speaking. So, I would run on my lunch hour from the Pentagon across the Memorial Bridge into D.C. Run right across the bridge, right up there, and you're seeing the Lincoln Memorial as you cross the bridge. Then you turn left and go down the mall all the way to Washington Monument. Circle that in front of the White House. Run back down the mall, across the bridge, and when you come back into Virginia, you're seeing all the graves of Arlington. You come back, you hit the shower. Well, I did that one day, and I come back in, and they said, Lieutenant Brown. I had not even gone to Made 04 yet. I said, Lieutenant Brown, did you see her? Did you see her? I said, see who? Demi Moore. She was right here right by your desk. And Demi Moore had come into my to our spaces at the Pentagon. This baby, she and Bruce Willis had this baby, and I missed her. So that would have been my claim to fame if I'd seen her. But I went to run that day and missed Demi Moore. So, but anyway, we had a lot of interesting experiences. They sent me to the Pentagon, and it's kind of like as a junior officer at the Pentagon, Brian, you're kind of like dirt on the carpet. You're an officer out in the fleet. Even as an 03 as a lieutenant, which is like a captain in the Army, you got a pretty good life, So you get respect by virtue of the fact you're wearing the rank, whether you've earned it or not, just the way it is. But I'll never forget the first day when I got to the Pentagon. First off, we have this thing in Washington called slugging to the Pentagon. What does that mean? That means literally if you're in uniform, because the traffic's so bad, you can stand out anywhere in uniform and basically hitchhike. And they pick you up and take you to the Pentagon because they're trying to get an HOV lane. So I was doing that. I'd slug into the Pentagon. And I was slugging into the Pentagon, getting ready to leave one afternoon and slug back. And I see this Air Force one-star general standing in the bus line holding his bags. Now, if you're in the military, you'll understand what that means. You never see a one-star general hold anything anywhere out other than in Washington. One-star general is like Moses walking through the Red Sea. The water will part, and it's a tension on deck or a tent hut, whatever you are. But it was quite the experience being a junior officer at the Pentagon. In retrospect, I'm glad I did it. Sometimes I wish they'd sent me somewhere else, but I'm just grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, you got some stories to tell your grandkids, and some life's experiences. Definitely, whether you're JAG or just any branch of the military, for sure. So, kind of digging into your book writing and a little bit of your JAG time. During your time in the JAG Corps, you gained some national attention. You were advocating for First Lieutenant Clint, forgive me if I say this wrong, Lorrance, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're close. He's actually pronounces that Lorrance, but
Lorrance.
I've seen it. Folks pronounce it both ways. He pronounces it Lorrance.
Okay.
You wouldn't know unless you knew.
Sure. You were advocating for First Lieutenant Clint Lorrance. You even wrote a book about the situation titled Travesty of Justice. The book was declared by talk show host Sean Hannity as a must-read. I've listened to Sean for a long time. I know he loves to read. So if he's declaring your book a must-read, it's probably something we should pick up and check out. For those who don't know, just a quick overview of the situation and what the book is about. U.S. Army First Lieutenant Clint Lorrance. He was a platoon leader of the 1st Platoon Charlie Troop, which was deployed to southern Afghanistan in the Kandahar province with the 73rd Cavalry Regiment, 4th Brigade Combat Team, 82nd Airborne Division. First Lieutenant Lorrance ordered his troops to open fire on 2 Afghan men on a motorcycle who he believed to be armed and a threat to their safety and security. In 2013, I believe I got the dates right, First Lieutenant Lorrance was found guilty by a court-martial and sentenced to 20 years in prison, which was then commuted to 19 years. Don, you served as a member of First Lieutenant Lorrance's legal defense team as his attorney during post-conviction appeals, I believe, which eventually culminating in you securing a presidential pardon for him from President Trump in 2019. So long as I got all that information correct anything that I didn't, can you tell us why that particular case struck a chord with not only you, but conservatives nationwide?
Well, sure. Brian, before I say that, I've been meaning to mention something to compliment you. You mentioned Sean Hannity. You and I talked for probably close to an hour on the phone the other day. I heard your work, and a great journalist does their homework, and you do your homework. And Sean Hannity, I've been really interviewed hundreds of times. Long before I started running for the Senate on this Lorrance case and other cases. Sean does his homework. You do your homework. It really shows, and it really makes for a great interview and helps folks to understand. So I compliment you on that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
You bet, brother. The Lorrance case. Well, first off, I left the JAG Corps. I left active duty when I became a part of Clint's defense team. The way it had come down the pike, when I was a JAG officer in San Diego, just a bit of a background on to set the stage. We had an F-14 fighter go down. The F-14 was the fighter jet that was predated the F-18. It was on the first Top Gun movie, and so our Top Gun school was at Miramar Naval Air Station in San Diego County at the time, and the jet went up with an instructor and a student, and they were headed down south to the Mexican border, which is just a hop, skip, and jump from the air station. They were going to turn right, and as they turned, something went wrong with the aircraft. Actually, what happened was the F-14 had what we call a hydraulic system. You had to believe it was, in other words, the flaps and everything changed because they're hydraulics in the tubing. And one of the ground crew neglected to bleed some air bubbles. They lost control. They tried to put it down in a small airfield called Brown Field right north of the Mexican border, and the jet crashed into that a hangar. It was a helicopter hangar, and we lost the student. I think the pilot survived. They bailed out. There was one death, but a lot of folks were injured on the ground. So I handled that case, and for the Navy, and so just a few years after I got out of the Navy, something told me I was watching a Facebook. Something popped up on Facebook that caught my attention, and it was a press conference that was being held in the National Press Club in Washington. And I saw some of the names, and there was a scroll there about a helicopter shoot down investigation. And I could see some of the more prominent conservative congressmen who were there with these families. And there were Louis Gohmert was there. He was in the Congress for a while. Lieutenant Colonel Alan West was there, a couple of others. And so I listened in to this press conference. And it was about the shoot down of a helicopter called Extortion 17 in Afghanistan in 2011. And something had gone wrong clearly. And something said, just send a note to one of the moms. I found her, Karen Bond, on Facebook. I said, listen, Karen, here's who I am. I'm an ex-JAG officer. I've handled a major aviation case, this F-14. I've also written, at that time, it was like 7 books. So if I can help you in any way, let me know. Really wasn't expecting to hear from her. She wrote back almost immediately. She said, we've been praying for somebody to come alongside us and help us. I met them, gained their trust. I wrote a book called Extortion 17 about that shoot down. And my life changed with that book because I got close to these Gold Star families who had lost their sons. This was the largest loss in the history of the U.S. Special Forces. We lost 17 members of SEAL Team 6, or United States Navy Developmental Group, or DEVGRU, the most lethal force in the military. And something had gone wrong. Either the guys had been sacrificed deliberately, or they died from negligence by the Obama Pentagon. So anyway, I got involved in that case, and through that case, I met a guy named Pete Hegseth. You know Pete Hegseth, now our Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, we've heard of him once or twice.
Yeah, but at the time, Pete was with a group called Concerned Veterans for America, and he was going around, helping veterans. And he migrated from there to Fox, but I got to know him, and it was Pete Hegseth who came to me really with the idea of helping Lieutenant Clint Lorrance. And here's what had happened. Around 2017 or 18, somewhere in there, during the first couple of years of the Trump administration, there were 2 prominent national cases involving military court-martial under the Obama Pentagon that came to the national limelight. One was a Navy SEAL named Eddie Gallagher, and the other was a Army Green Beret named Matt Goldstein. Goldstein had been on a brag. Eddie had been in San Diego, but they both were being charged with murder for battlefield incidents, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan. Well, this is 2017 or so. Back in 2013, Lorrance had been convicted also for murder when his men opened fire in Afghanistan on a motorcycle that was charging their position. And these motorcycles have been coming up to the top of these platoons and pulling the ripcord, and, just blowing themselves up. And we had some Afghan soldiers at the front of that platoon who opened fire. Lawrence's men requested permission to open fire. Clint couldn't even see the motorcycle. They were in a single file platoon. He was going back several hundred yards down to the bottom of a great berm. He gave them permission to open fire. They opened fire. 2 of the 3 riders were killed. And the Army, under Obama, basically told Clint's men, either you testify against your lieutenant or we will prosecute you for murder too. They were trying to they wanted to scalp the hands of the Karzai government for some number of reasons. And they got him convicted, and they sent him to Leavenworth on a 20-year sentence, later reduced to 19 years. And so fast forward from 2013 to about 2017-18, Pete Hegseth remembered this case. And he knew that these other 2 guys were, now facing the national limelight, but Clint had been forgotten. So Pete came to me and he said, hey, Don, and he knew I'd written some books. He knew I was involved in the extortion case. He said, if you write a book on this, I'll give you all the national TV time you want, and we will make a pitch to President Trump to pardon this kid. I said, you got a deal. So in 2018 and 19, I made multiple trips. So 17, 18, up to 19 to Leavenworth. Dozens of trips out there on my own dime, basically, to visit with Clint and some other Americans who are being held there, and some are still there, as a matter of fact, as a result of the Afghan war. The book came out in April, and Clint, Pete, as he promised, they flew me up to New York into the Fox studios, announced the book. I was being interviewed by Pete and Ed Henry at the time, and we started making pitches directly to President Trump to remember Clint and to pardon him. Fast forward to November of 2019. On that night, November the 15th, 2019, President Trump pardoned all 3 of those guys It was a day I'll never forget in all my life. I've been out at Leavenworth all week waiting for, I've been in touch with Pete off and on all the time. We were talking about every other day. We were getting signals from the president he was going to pardon. And and he did. And so that's how it kind of came about. And so it was just a matter of, kind of being in the right place at the right time. And, I mean, you talk about, listen, let me tell you something. I wouldn't trade that experience. I wouldn't trade getting elected to the Senate for that experience. I'm telling you. That's how much it meant to me just to see that kid, he had been in prison, was going to be there another 13 years on a political prosecution, essentially, to see the Army be forced to put him in his dress blues and take him out of that prison after being falsely imprisoned like that. And it was just one of those God things. And it's an experience I'll never forget.
That's a hell of an experience, Don. And I'm glad that you were able to help him, along with Pete Hegseth and the other folks that were able to help him, and the many folks that are wrongly in prison for stuff like that. The politics and military use, it just doesn't mix. But too long, it has been mixing. And there has to be a separation there. I know Pete Hegseth now, as Secretary of Defense, is doing a wonderful job. And he's letting the military be the military. And that's what I think we need to do. Keep the politics out of it. Let them be the military and do the job that they were hired to do. So I'm glad that you were able to help Lieutenant Lorrance. That's some pretty important work right there. You've done all kinds of work, in your JAG, out of JAG. You got your own law practice, a Charlotte-based law office, from what I understand. You've taken on some kind of pretty tough and some high-profile cases. You've gone in, South Carolina, North Carolina, Supreme Court. You have taken on some big cases. Can you sort of briefly maybe explain how some of the cases that you've handled exemplify your approach to public service? Maybe tell North Carolina voters what it tells them about your priorities?
I appreciate all that. I go where I feel like I'm called, and I would cite, whether you call it a big case or not, I would cite it as a fairly high profile case. I got involved in the vaccine litigation. So when the COVID thing comes along, I'm taking a very public stand against the mask and against the jabs. And during that period of time, I got into a pretty high-profile debate on Facebook with Jerry Valancourt, who has since passed away. Jerry Valancourt was a longtime voice of the Charlotte Hornets. And when the Hornets moved to New Orleans, he went with them, then he came back. He was left-wing liberal, nice fella. We had a relationship talking sports, and then when COVID comes along, we get into it. And I'm saying that, the masks are a scam. We're being lied to. Because I was doing my research, my homework, and he said, "Oh, take the mask." And then we come along with the jabs, and I'm arguing against those as well because I knew that they were under what we call an emergency use authorization. They'd not been adequately tested. Nobody knew what they were going to do. And I'm trying to caution people, and all the time getting banned from Twitter and getting banned from Facebook, get banned here, there, and the other. But as a result of some of this, of course, I had folks come to me, and I had several folks who did not want to take the jab for religious reasons. Of course, we brought those cases before the EEOC. But there was I would say, a fairly large case that I got involved with. I'm licensed both in North and South Carolina. I had to go into the Navy JAG Corps. I had to pick a bar, any bar. So I took both bars, and by the grace of God, passed them both. Hope I never take another one. But I was licensed in South Carolina, still am, and there's a large nuclear facility down in Aiken, or right across, or North Augusta, South Carolina, Aiken, South Carolina, called Savannah River Nuclear Plant. And it's owned by the United States government. We were using it to build components for hydrogen bombs, and now we still use it for fusion materials for nuclear bombs. And what happened is the Biden department, Joe Biden's Department of Energy, went to the Savannah River Plant and said, "Hey, you force your employees to take the jab, we're going to cut our federal funding." And so initially about 100 of them came to me, and we started talking and wound up with about 78 of them. And we filed suit against Savannah River Plant. And we were arguing at the time Savannah River plant is not a government, so you can't really sue it for constitutional violations like you could the U.S. government directly or any other governmental entity. But we were suing based on the theory that they were violating South Carolina statute against practicing medicine without a license. I mean, you just think about it now, Brian. If I'm coming in here and I'm prescribing you a doggone shot to take and stick it in your arm, how can you say that's not practicing medicine? So the case winds up in the federal court in Columbia, South Carolina. Now, you may remember when Biden was in the White House, he said he was going to pick a quote unquote woman of color, to be on the Supreme Court, which he did. He had 3 finalists, however. He wound up picking Jackson Brown, probably the worst one that he could pick. One of the 3 finalists was a federal judge named Michelle Childs, that was in Columbia, South Carolina. She was nominated by Lindsey Graham to be on the court there. So we take the case in front of her, and we hit really, really, really hard. And we knew what was going to happen. She was a Democrat, so she says, "Well, I don't find that it's practicing medicine." Blah 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 blah. So we appealed the case to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond, which is right under the Supreme Court. And eventually, Biden backed down. Because I think not because of my brilliant lawyering so much, but because the midterms are coming, they're worried about how they're going to get burned. So they backed down, and we were able to save the jobs of those folks. And many of those, I think I mentioned, were nuclear engineers. I mean, I had a bunch of smart plaintiffs we were representing, and so we were able to save their jobs. And part of the moral of the story is, like my dad used to. One of the things my daddy told me back in Plymouth is one thing that I never forgotten. He said, "The best ability is stickability." So I think that's true for anything. So we're sticking with this fight. We were prepared to take it to the Supreme Court if we needed to do that. But they backed down. But here's one thing I'll share with you that I share a lot of times on the campaign trail that I think our folks should know, and that is this. The federal government has a system for monitoring vaccine reactions. It's called VAERS. It's VAERS, or Victor Alpha Romeo Echo Sierra, VAERS. It means Vaccine Adverse Early Reaction System. It's a voluntary system, and it's been in place, for well over 30 years. And if you know anything about it, you know that all throughout its history, if anything goes wrong with any vax, let's say you're taking a rubella vax or a smallpox vax, whatever the vax is, if there anything going wrong with 2 or 3 of those vaxes, they'll shut the FDA will shut the entire vax program down so they can figure out what's wrong, because it's possible that there could be some bad batches out there that could harm people. Well, so in other words, it didn't take much in the history of this VAERS system for the federal government to shut down a vax. Well, I want you to hear this from January until October of 2021. There were more deaths reported from the 3 experimental COVID vaccines, more deaths reported in that 10-month period than from every other vaccine combined over a 30-year period. And your crooked, corrupt federal government hid that information from you and from all your listeners and all your friends, and so did this complicit communist media. That's how bad it is. And so, you asked for an example of a higher profile. That'd be the one I would say, was involved. That also involved some of the election fraud litigation in 2020. I could talk about that a little bit also if you like, but that's one that there have been several things that have really changed the way I've looked at the inside of the government, and these are some of the cases I've been involved with. I mean, the extortion case where these guys were basically flown, these Navy SEALs were flown into a Taliban trap 90 days after bin Laden was taken out under strange circumstances. They appear to have been sacrificed. Then you have the situation with these jabs, and it's very, very true. Bobby Kennedy did his country a service when he wrote a book called The Real Anthony Fauci, and this was years before he would ever even have considered working for Donald Trump. But he wrote this book called Real Anthony Fauci, and I listened to it driving down to Florida on audio. And he points out that the poorer countries around the world that could not afford these experimental jabs, which are still under an emergency use authorization, and the government still pushes them. These poorer countries using ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine had a much, much lower death rate than we did. And we're spending millions and millions of dollars. And he pointed out another thing Bobby Kennedy did. if folks were to get folks who were getting COVID and going to the hospital, Fauci was pushing this regimen that first would put them on a drug called remdesivir, and then from there to the ventilator. Well, this remdesivir, in the years just before COVID, was being used as an experimental drug in Africa for Ebola and AIDS patients. And this remdesivir was causing major organ failure. And in fact, it had a death rate of over 50% because of kidney failure and other major organ failure. They pulled it off of the market in Africa, but then made it a frontline regimen of medicine in the United States. And the government was paying hospitals to use it, and then paying the hospitals to use the ventilators. And so one of the things I'm pushing is I feel very strongly, if elected to the Senate, I'm going to be a champion for medical freedom. But I think we need a federal vaccination and mass protection act so the Democrats can't pull this garbage again on us like they have done. And that's something that is I'm pretty passionate about. I've lost a couple of friends who took remdesivir here today and gone tomorrow, and it was just a time in our country's history that we cannot allow to be repeated. We learned a lot about how far the government and its corporate lackeys will go to control us. We just can't let that happen again, Brian.
I absolutely agree. And that was a very dark time in our history. There's been a lot of things that we've lived through, but that was something that really bothered me personally, and a lot of people that I know.
Sure.
To see government live experimenting on humans. And I only know one other time in history where that has been brought to public light. And I'm not going to, be specific, but I'm just going to say it was in another country, probably around Germany, around the 40s.
Yeah.
So it was parallel to that, and it was making me very nervous. We all had our issues with that, and hopefully that never happens again, because I don't think it's going to go the same way. I think there's going to be a lot more pushback.
Absolutely, brother. For the time being, I think it's not a good time for the Democrats to try that again. The problem is, as time goes on and memories start to fade, it's just a real scary thing is how people can be led around so easily. And the enemy has always used fear as a manipulative control tactic. And that's exactly what happened during COVID. And I hope a lot of folks have wised up to it.
Sure, absolutely. You mentioned several other cases that you've done. You've done a lot of work in the military, in your private law firm. Getting into politics, in 2024, you ran for U.S. House Representative for North Carolina's District 8. You did, unfortunately, lose the Republican primary to Representative Mark Harris with only about 10.5% of the votes. But I've always been a believer that the good Lord will close the door he doesn't want you to go through, because he's going to open another one for you. So do you feel strongly now that you will get the needed support of the North Carolina voter in this Senate race?
Well, let me just say this first. If I'd known that Mark Harris is going to be as good as he's been, I wouldn't have run for that seat to begin with. That seat had opened up. I'm very good friends with Dan Bishop, who is now the deputy. He's a deputy director of Office of Management and Budget. Wish he'd been elected as Attorney General. So Dan's seat opened, and we jumped into the race with a March 3rd or March 5th primary. And from there, we jumped into the race literally the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. You learn a lot of lessons. You can't get much campaigning or fundraising or anything done over the holidays. We had a very short runway and had a lot of and I have great respect for Mark, and never said one negative thing about him at all. Would not do that during the course of the election, and have been supportive of him. He's been the strongest member of the North Carolina congressional delegation by far, in my opinion, in the short amount of time that he's been in office. So I don't think it was unfortunate that I lost that race. Things are supposed to work out. They're supposed to work out. As far as the Senate race goes, this was not on my radar. I had left my congressional campaign technically open but dormant with the FEC. In other words, not closed it, but it was dormant with the FEC. And part of the reason was that we had heard Tillis was not going to run, and I was kind of hoping Mark might run for it. And if Mark had run for it, I might have run in the 8th district again. But he's smarter than me, so he So, Mark, you should run. No, you're not going to run for it. So that's kind of how it came about. But even still, my plan wasn't to run for the Senate. But a lot of Mark supporters and the supporters of the other folks that I ran against encouraged me to run for the Senate. Tillis was extremely unpopular, and he brought it on himself from his anti-Trump record. But he was hitting Trump on. He would argue that he was supported Trump most of the time, but he was hitting Trump on some of the most important issues that are hot fuse issues, particularly immigration. He was very, very weak on immigration, and supported Robert Mueller. To give him legal protection in the first Trump administration. Mueller, in my opinion, was unconstitutionally appointed. But even still, I wasn't planning to do this, but I was having a lot of my supporters and Mark supporters and Alan Bauckham supporters and Lee Brown supporters. Run, you should run, you should run, you should run. I thought they were crazy. I think, though, that the thing that sort of tipped it over, and of course, Andy Nelson had gotten the race, but I think the thing that sort of tipped the balance was when, as I mentioned, I have a relationship with Pete Hegseth, although, to be fair, I've communicated with him since about October. He's got more important things to do than mess with me at this point. But when Tillis, after having promised to support President Trump's nominees when they came out of committee, and Pete came out of Armed Services Committee, Tillis turned around and tried to take an affidavit from his former sister-in-law in a clear attempt to try to tube that nomination. I think that was what tipped the scale, and I felt like Tillis needed to go, and we needed the MAGA first, America first MAGA conservative in the race, and so here we are. That's kind of how it came about.
Absolutely, and I think what really brought a lot of things to light. While we were watching Tom Tillis the whole time, the Ed Martin case really kind of pushed him into the limelight for a lot of people who weren't watching him.
And Ed Martin, and one of the things that you were asking about high-profile cases, I'm a J6 attorney. In other words, I've represented J6 patriots. I had a kid, and I'm one of a very small handful of attorneys I've had in the United States to have President Trump pardon two of my clients. There was Lieutenant Lorrance, and I represented a kid at the Capitol on J6 named Elliot Bechet, who 20 years old. We think he may be the youngest of the defendants, just walked into the Capitol, walked around, and walked out, and got prosecuted. I've given legal advice to other J6 patriots, and there's a kid named Elias Arizari who was kicked out of the Citadel. We worked with him to help him get back into the Citadel. I couldn't actually represent him in court because it would be technically a conflict. But Ed Martin was going to expose a lot of the unanswered questions with regard to J6, such as who put the pipe bombs at the DNC and the RNC, the so-called pipe bombs, I should say, and who put those gallows there. We'd like to know the answer to that question. The Democrats want you to think it was Trump supporters, but Ed Martin was going to get to the bottom of it. And why Tillis torpedoed him is beyond me. Of course, I've made a decision to get in the race based on what he tried to do to Pete, but he did, in fact, torpedo and kill Ed Martin's nomination as U.S. Attorney. Now, hopefully, Judge Deneen is going to be a bear for them as well, but there are folks who don't want to know the truth to come out on January 6th, even to this day. I had a book released in October, just before the election, called Kangaroo Court, and it is a look at the Democrats' prosecutions, using the courts to politically prosecute folks going back about 30 years. It looks at some of the Trump cases. It looked at some cases involving other politicians, like the governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, who was prosecuted by the same Jack Smith, reversed by the Supreme Court. Rick Perry was prosecuted as governor of Texas simply because he vetoed a bill, which he was allowed to do under Texas Constitution. But I look at a lot of different cases, and I have a chapter in the book basically called George Floyd versus J6. And it's a look at the way these prosecutions were handled differently. If you look at the George Floyd prosecutions, by the way, you can read a lot of my stuff online. I've written a number of op-eds. You can go to American Thinker, and I've written a number of op-eds in American Thinker. I wrote an op-ed called Who Killed George Floyd? And I did a lot of work on that. I read the Hennepin County coroner's report and watched over an hour worth of body cam video from the cops. The Hennepin County, the original coroner's report, concluded that George Floyd had over 3 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his body. So basically, he committed suicide with fentanyl, even though they wound up blaming the officer. But the Democrats used that as a springboard for a false narrative to try to tear the country apart. And over $2 billion worth of damage, the most expensive riots in American history. Around 20 people killed, some of the crossfire. But of all those prosecutions spread about over these big Democrat cities like Seattle and Portland, and in Chicago, and just take your pick, the Democrat prosecutors dismissed 95% of the misdemeanor prosecutions in the George Floyd cases. Now, compare and contrast that to the J6 cases, where 99%, almost 99% of the cases were prosecuted. Virtually zero were dismissed. And most of those were misdemeanor, just like the kid I represented. And then they took a section of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and maybe you remember this kid, Jacob Chansley. He's the one that had the horns. Remember? The one runs the horns?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And they called him the face of the insurrection. The face of the insurrection. Well, one good thing that McCarthy did before he was no longer the speaker is he gave a bunch of tape to Tucker Carlson, who played the tape of that Jacob Chansley kid. You remember walking around, yucking it up with Capitol Police officers. They actually let him into the Senate floor where he prayed, and the Democrat media was calling him the first of the insurrection. Well, Jacob Chansley, he's one of those defendants that they wanted to charge him with a felony so bad, they took part of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. That is a financial crimes act. And they twisted it around. See, Sarbanes-Oxley's back, remember the Enron scandal. They passed Sarbanes-Oxley to force companies to be transparent with their profits and losses. Well, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, this provision of it said you can't destroy financial documents. So they take this document shredding provision and twist it around to have an excuse to go after Trump supporters at J6. And one of those was Jacob Chansley. So President Trump, when he pardoned every one of the J6 defendants, I was okay with it because the whole prosecutorial scheme had been an attack on the United States Constitution. You don't dismiss 95% of George Floyd cases and prosecute 99% of J6 protesters. When you do that, there is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. In the 14th Amendment and read into the 5th Amendment, those Trump supporters who were prosecuted had their right to equal protection violated because they were treated differently. And I've been involved in some of these J6 cases and all those got on the news. You ask about some high-profile cases, but these are things that I got involved with just because I'm passionate about. I hate to see the Constitution trashed. And these rogue prosecutors like Jack Smith, Alvin Bragg, Fannie Willis, Letitia James, they have all waged war on the Constitution with these political show trials. And I think they all ought to be prosecuted. I hope Pam Bondi will turn the heat on. But those are a couple of cases I've been involved with you ask about, and I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see some stuff happen. We've still got 3 years to go here. As far as, the J6 guys, I'm right there with you. I don't think it was an attack on the Constitution so much as constitutional violations for them. This was an attack on Trump, a proxy attack on Trump, if you will.
All right.
Anything to do with Trump. And it's getting old at this point, to be honest with you.
All right.
I went on and looked at some of the policies that you are working on, some of the things that you want to champion as a senator. Just briefly running through a couple of them, the Deep State Reduction Act, IRS Federal Income Tax Elimination Act. I'm a big fan of that one. Judicial Separation of Powers Act, also a big fan. Congressional term limits is a very big one for me. And you've got several more. As I look through them, I would say that a lot of your policies, it sounds like to me, align with something that a group called the Convention of States is working on. This group, Convention of States Action, are working to push for an Article 5 convention, Article 5 of the Constitution, whereby it bypasses Congress and lets the people hold a convention to discuss constitutional amendments.
That's right.
And their goals are limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, and placing term limits on federal officials. Would you say that you support the grassroots effort to call for an Article 5 convention?
Oh, I've been calling for that for months, if not years. Article 5, of course, the U.S. Constitution has 7 articles and 27 amendments. Article 5, as you point out, is the procedure under which the Constitution is amended. It can be amended. The amendment process can start one of two ways: one, in the Congress, or two, with this Convention of States. And the reason this Convention of States provision was actually put in the Constitution is because the end of the day, the founders didn't fully even trust Congress to always start the amendment process, so they left it to the states to be able to do that. But absolutely, if you think the 3 objectives of the Convention of States movement are fiscal restraint on the government, but the one that is going to drive it, of course, is term limits. The term limits is number 2 or 3. But if you think about this, some argue for term limits, some for against. I can see the arguments both ways, but at the end of the day, I've come to the conclusion that absolute power corrupts and power corrupts absolutely. And the one example on term limits that I like to use, if you think about Joe Biden, he went into the Senate in 1974. Now think if you had, and I would favor two terms for a senator, which would be 12 years, and then you're done. So let's say you had a 2-term limit on the U.S. Senate. Joe Biden went into the Senate in 74. He would have had to go out in 86. You would never have heard from him again. But instead, he stayed and accumulated power. And there was more and more and more corruption. So to answer your question, I'm a 1,000% supporter of the Convention of States movement. It is a provision of the United States Constitution, and the objectives that the COS supporters are embracing are right on mark, and they do reflect, by constitutional amendment, a number of the legislative acts that you have quoted that I am pushing and have been pushing all along and continue to do so.
That's awesome. For you guys who don't know, go to conventionofstates.com. Just check it out. If you find it something you support, man, sign a petition. Moving on from that, we talked a lot about your law career, and just want to throw this out. I know we don't have a lot of time left. So Andy Nilsen, one of your competitors in the Republican primary here, he says that we don't need more lawyers in Washington. His look is that we need businessmen, not bureaucrats, and they are the ones who should be running things. Now, President Trump's outsider status has resonated with a lot of North Carolina voters, especially when you see President Trump himself having such a wildly successful example of being a businessman coming into politics and not necessarily a lifelong politician or a lawyer. How would you respond to that? Do you see your experience as more of an asset rather than a liability in Washington?
Well, a couple of things. I don't know if Andy understands this or not, but when you run a small law firm for 30-some years, you got payroll taxes, you got to deal with the government, you've got to run a business. So I've run a business on my own for a long time. I'm also an author and an ex-military officer. So the lawyer part, you act like somebody who runs a law firm doesn't run a business. But here's the thing about it. I like to joke around. I don't always tell anybody I'm a lawyer because I want to have some friends. But here's the truth of the matter. The truth is the problem is not lawyers. The problem is liberals who become lawyers. It was a lawyer, James Madison, who wrote the Constitution itself. And Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was a lawyer. When you find a conservative constitutional attorney, we're such a rare breed, you better hang on to us. But if you're a liberal lawyer can do a lot of damage. So, I don't, paint in broad strokes. I try to look really, really closely at who the person is. What we need in the United States Senate, in the United States Congress, we need patriots who are willing to give their life for the country. That's what I am first and foremost. I'm more of a naval officer than I'm a lawyer. I'm more probably of an author than a lawyer. But I've used my skills and talents as an attorney to fight for righteousness and justice, just like trying to secure a pardon for Lieutenant Lorrance. I was going against the grain and catching lots of flack and call this and call that, or trying to battle the election steal. I worked very closely with Sidney Powell, who has endorsed our campaign, going against a headwind, knowing that the 2020 election was stolen, or even fighting against the unconstitutional vax mandates. When you find an attorney that's willing to go against the grain and stand for the Constitution, you better send him to Washington. If you got a liberal lawyer, I don't want to send a liberal lawyer to Washington either. I hope that answers the question.
That answers it perfectly. I appreciate that. And Don, I know that you've got something coming up here in just a couple minutes, so I won't keep you. I had a whole lot more, and I would love to have you on again in the future, especially throughout your campaign. Um, I do appreciate your time. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your serving in uniform for us, serving in the courtroom for us, your books. I'm going to be honest, I haven't read any, but I have looked into them, and they sound amazing. I do plan on getting some because I do like that kind of writing. And for any of those who are interested, you guys can go to donbrownbooks.com, check out his books, get you some. There's links on there where you can purchase them. If you want to know more about Don Brown, go to donbrownfornc.com, get all the information on him. Don, we really appreciate you. We're going to be keeping an eye on the Senate right with you as it progresses, and we wish you good luck with this race.
Thank you, Brian. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to have some conversation. Hope to chat again real soon. You have a blessed week.
You do the same, Don. And for everybody out there, as always, stay safe and God bless.